for joining me for this Wednesday evening service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. For the past several weeks, we've been in the Gospel of Luke, and we've been looking at one specific passage of Scripture from Luke chapter 15. It's the parable of the prodigal. And so it seems to have been wonderfully simple, this little story in our Bible. However, as you have seen, it is not so simple after all. It is full of information, and where it lacks information, it's full of places where it invites us to read between the lines in the story. From the outset, I have told you that you would discover yourself in the story, so perhaps you saw yourself as the younger son departing for the far country. Or maybe you are the younger son who's hit rock bottom and you're coming home to the father. Or maybe you're the elder brother with all of his own bitterness who is distant from the father. One of those boys was lost in the far country. The other boy was lost at home. In fact, for most of my ministry, I can only see myself as one of those two boys. But who should I be? Who is the example in the story? Whose heart should I reflect toward my own children and toward others who are either broken by sin or in the bondage of some bitterness? In fact, you and I should be on the journey of becoming the Father. The Father, of course, is a picture of God welcoming the broken and embracing the bitter. So as we conclude our study of this parable, our focus is going to be on Him. He is, for us, a perfect picture of Christlikeness. Let me read a few verses from the story now to remind you from the parable of the prodigal, beginning to read in chapter 15. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again, and he was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. That's the return of the younger son, the younger brother. But the older brother, the Bible says, Jesus telling the story, was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, Look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, Son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and to be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found. Now let's see if we can unfold the characteristics in this story that we see about the Father. First, let me share with you his generosity. I reminded you last week when we looked at the story that Jesus said the Father divided his wealth between them. Literally, the Greek word is bios, from which we get our word biology, which means that he divided his life between them. The King James says living. In other words, he held nothing back. He didn't withhold for fear of what he might lose. He was not a hoarder who looked out only for himself. In his wealth, his single focus was on what he could give away. Tight-fisted living is always self-centered living. This was an open-handed and open-hearted man. Even his servants had more than enough bread. He was not diminished by what he gave. He was not the poorer by what the younger son lost. There was still more to give. The richness of his grace is never spent, not when he pours it out or when he pours it into us to give, there is always more. That's the Father's generosity. Second, we want to consider the Father's vision. In the story, we are told that it was while the younger son was still a long way off that his father saw him. How far can the Father see? Of course, because this is a picture of God, we know that the Father saw the rebellion in the boy's heart long before he ever asked for his share of the estate, and he gave it to him knowing exactly what he would do and where he would go and what would happen in the process. The Father could also see the bitterness and resentment in the heart of the elder brother long before it surfaced. He could see into the heart of them both. He sees far more than the story reveals. And the Father sees far more about you and me than we can fathom. There is no limit to the Father's vision. If you are still a long way off, He sees you where you are. But the beauty of the Father's vision is this: He not only sees us where we are at the moment, He sees who we can become. Not only so, but He also understood how He could be a part of moving them in that direction. His influence was the key to their becoming. So we've considered first, the Father's generosity. Second, the Father's vision. Third, consider His optimism. Do you realize that He was hopeful in the midst of these broken relationships? One of the reasons He was hopeful is that the relationship was never broken from His side. As far as He was concerned, there was always room for reconciliation. Is that how it is with you in your relationships with others? That's how it should be. It would have been easy for Him to write off the younger son as lost and his older son as hopelessly bitter. But it's amazing that He manifested a total absence of resentment even when His love and His compassion and His generosity were taken for granted. Neither son in the story appeared to genuinely care about the Father. They only cared about what the Father could give. Do you suppose that God sees similar behaviors in us? Even in our praying, His heart and His feelings are not important to us. Yet their actions never moved Him to be bitter or resentful toward them. He was free of any ill will toward His sons. Fourth, we'll consider the Father's unconditional love. Genuine love is truly sacrificial. The Father gave without thought of return, and He lost without bearing resentment. In fact, from the Father's perspective, the greatest loss was the loss of a son, and the greatest return on the investment, on His investment of giving and loving, was to have a son back safe and sound. Unconditional love places more value on relationships than on trivial things that divide. Everything else is unimportant. A son come home is more important than a treasure that is lost. The Father's love was a love that cared and a love that covered. I guess I never really understood this story as fully as I should from the Father's perspective until my youngest daughter was unmarried and pregnant. And of course that brought brokenness into our family. It brought pain to her father's heart. But most of all, it brought shame to her. But the most shameful moment of all for her, I think, was that moment when she went back to church for the first time. She was obviously showing. I walked into church with her. Every eye turned toward her. I felt her shame and her pain as her dad. But I want to tell you, I was not ashamed of her. I loved her with a love that was intense and wished in that moment that I could cover her and hide her from the eyes of others and from the pain of that moment. That is the love that the Father had toward this younger son. He saw him a long way off. He ran. He embraced him. He kissed him. He arranged for him to be covered. There was never any mention of the far country. There was no mention of what had been lost. The father's love was incredibly important at that moment because the prodigal, you see, no longer loved himself. It may be that as you listen today, you are still that prodigal who can't love yourself. You remember all the things you've done. You know all the things that have hurt your father. And you just don't see how anyone could love you. But the Father's love is unconditional, just as strong, just as passionate, just as true as the Father in the story, his love was for the prodigal, is God's love for you. Number 5, I want you to consider the Father's suffering. I have been a dad now for 44 years. When I just got started in my journey of fatherhood, older people would come up to me when I was playing with my little children, and they would say, when your kids are little, they step on your toes, and when they grow up, they step on your heart. I know now by experience that when your heart gets stepped on, that your skills at parenting are stretched to the limit. When Jesus begins the story, it appears that the youngest son has just stepped on his dad's heart. And of course, before the story is over, the older brother also stepped on his dad's heart. But it wasn't something that just happened. This father in the story saw it coming for a long time. He could read the rebellion and the bitterness in the hearts of his children. Parents often hear things that children never say, especially hurtful things. I'm sure this dad in the story had been hurt before. The day his son confronted him and asked him for his share of the family estate was just one more of the many painful darts that had been cast at that father's heart. We understand the picture of the suffering servant in Isaiah chapter 53. But what we really have in that story is the picture of the heart of a God who suffers over our lostness and because of it. Just as the heart of a parent is pained when that child rejects his love, so the Father's heart suffers beyond telling when his children honor him only with lip service while their hearts are far from him. If you are a parent, you know a portion of that pain. But in terms of God, his suffering includes not only the pain at our departure, but the pain of the price of our return. Our waste is beyond telling, and the cost of our coming home is the cross. Number 6, consider with me the Father's forgiveness. You know, before we will forgive, I'm talking about from a human perspective, we have to state the case. We have to try the case like the judge and jury. The person must be condemned and required to grovel and beg. They must know their own unworthiness and must remain in that position long enough for us to be satisfied a lesson has been learned, and then maybe we will forgive. I'll never forget one conversation I had with a lady who had been hurt by her husband. We were sitting on the front steps of a rural church in Louisiana, and as she sat there with me and we talked together, she said, I will forgive him, but I'm never going to let him forget it. Well, that's not really forgiveness, is it? But in this story, there's no lecture from the father for the younger son, no mention of the loss of possessions or property, no reminder of what it cost the father to lose it, no mention of what it would cost the father to bring him home. There was just a loving embrace. That relationship, after all, was the greatest treasure to that father's heart. The father's forgiveness refuses to wait for the other person to come and rehearse the request. It runs to forgive. It reaches out. It entreats the other person to come back into the relationship. which is what God has been doing with you all along as we've been studying this parable. He's been speaking to you about your personal distance from him and speaking to you about the person that he wants you to be. God deals with us the same way the father dealt with the prodigal and with the elder brother. But he also expects you to extend the same richness of mercy in your personal relationships. The other person, that other person who hurt you, is never the one responsible for seeking reconciliation. This picture of Christlikeness demands that you run, that you embrace, that you cover, that you entreat. That is the kind of forgiveness the Father offers. Number 7, let's consider the Father's joy. If you look at the whole chapter of the 15th chapter of Luke, you will discover really it's all about joy. The shepherd in the first of the story who had 100 sheep and lost one, goes out and searches for it. And Jesus, as he was telling the story, said when he finds it, he returns with rejoicing and invites others to join with him. And then Jesus reminds us that there is joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. And then Jesus tells the story about the woman who had lost one coin. She had 10, she lost one. And she searches the house diligently until she finds it. And when she finds it, she invites her friends and neighbors to come to the party and join her in the celebration. And again, Jesus reminds us a second time that there is joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. And then there is the story of this father who lost a son, and upon his return throws a celebration, throws a party. He was a man of joy. I like church to be a happy place. We have enough unhappiness in our lives and in our world. The church should reflect the Father's house and the Father's heart. And anytime one sinner repents, we ought to throw a party to reflect the joy of heaven. Our passion as a church should be to see the lost come to know Christ. We should enter into the Father's joy. Number 8, I want you to consider the Father's timetable for restoration. And this will be the last characteristic we'll consider. Should you decide to come home to God, you personally, how long will it be before the Father accepts you again as his own? How long will you have to wait in the shadows of your personal shame? How long will you have to grovel at his feet begging for mercy? What is the Father's timetable for restoration? You will notice what he said to his servants. His timetable is stated in one word. When the Father sent the servants to get the robe, the ring, and the shoes, he said, quickly. And by the way, the Greek word translated quickly is the base word from which we get our word tachometer. It measures the speed of something. The word is the little Greek word tachus, which means speedily, quickly. The Father ran. He initiated the restoration. He anticipated the restoration. He also went out and entreated the older brother. The Father seeks restoration for you more than you want it for yourself. The prodigal was ready to settle for being a servant, but the Father immediately received him back as a son. So I want to ask you as we move toward the conclusion of our study, is it time for you to come home? Let me conclude with a paragraph from a little book I read some years ago by the author Henri Nouwen. He speaks about the Father's hands in this story. He said of the Father's hands, "They have held me from the hour of my conception. They welcomed me at my birth. They held me close to my mother's breast, fed me and kept me warm. They have protected me in times of danger. They have consoled me in times of grief. They have waved me goodbye and always welcomed me back. Those hands are God's hands. Have you come to the realization as we've walked through this study that God is trying to find you, to know you, and love you? God is looking in the distance for you and longing for you to simply come home. From wherever you are and whatever you have become in the far country, from whatever coldness or resentment you bear in your heart toward the Father for what He has done for someone else and not done for you, the Father still stands ready with His arms open to receive you. For those of us who are ready, this is a picture of God, and it's the picture of who God wants us to be to others. He wants us, you and me, to be agents of blessing in the lives of others, not looking for what we can get anymore, but looking for how we can invest in the lives of others. And whatever we invest is never lost. We give out of the riches of His grace, which He continually pours back into our lives. I don't know who you've decided you are in this story. You might have been the prodigal. You might have at one time be the elder brother. But is it time for you to become the father in the story, modeling His character in your relationships and sharing His joy? Thank you so much for joining us in our journey of this study. I pray that God would continue to bless your life as the days go forward. He loves you and He cares about you far more than you can imagine. And no matter what you've done or where you've been, He wants to cover you in His love and receive you as His own. Thank you so much for listening.